dear. Oh dear. Sorry about this, but I have backache, serious backache, and I've moved myself, not the computer. So I've got my books holding up the speaker so that I can record and my back will not be as uncomfortable on the settee as it would be on that hard chair that the manager gave me to use today. And I've sat on it all evening since the last recording, looking for 3 meditation books for the new year. I found some, but frustrating. And I haven't succeeded in buying them. There's one company, or charity they are. They sell, they're nuns and people who raise money for the missions. And I'm considering to buy from them now because they've got a phone number as well as an email and they're contactable. So I didn't succeed. And I did speak to Deborah in Australia. And I said I'd do this book, and I will. It's Cardinal Nguyen van Thuan, and I'll describe it before I begin, because today was a feast day of the martyrs from Vietnam, but I don't know, it was way back in the 1800s. This is in 1975. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy Michael, Archangel, defend me in this day of battle. Be my safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, I humbly pray. And do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust down to hell Satan and all the wicked evil spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Amen. And, O angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this night be at my side, to light, to guard, to rule and guide. Amen. So I will read about the book in case you need to know first. In 1975, as the communists finally overtook South Vietnam, Archbishop Thuan was picked up in Saigon and began 13 years of imprisonment, including years in solitary confinement. Highly intelligent, able and gifted, and above all, a man of deep faith. Thuan's spiritual journey, along with his life, before and after, is chronicled in this small booklet. It's a Catholic Truth Society booklet, ISBN 978 186 082 5835. Thuan's story has become a remarkable testimony to Christian love, fortitude and forgiveness, where the light of hope never dims. In 2001, John Paul II made him a cardinal. He died the following year. ETHEL TOLANSKY, who wrote this, formerly head of French at the University of Westminster, and HELENA Scott, research assistant, translator and writer, have jointly authored several other biographies to date. So this was completed by them. And it was the contents: Archbishop Thuan and Vietnam, early life, joy and hope, Bishop Thuan, witness to hope, Cardinal Thuan, the final years. Note on the name Francis Xavier Nguyen van Thuan. Nguyen is the family name. Van is a second family name. Thuan is the given name. Vietnamese Christians often place their Christian name, in this case, Francis Xavier, before the family name. The Vietnamese never call people by their family name, so Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen van Thuan may properly be referred to as Cardinal Thuan. Archbishop Thuan and Vietnam. The Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, 15th of August, had always been one of the favourite feast days of the coadjutor Archbishop of Saigon. Francis Xavier Nguyen van Thuan, in 1975, it was a day that changed his life dramatically. Archbishop Thuan had been appointed to his post the previous April and had now been in the former Saigon, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City, for just over 3 months, a period of uneasy quiet between himself and the new communist authorities. He knew that they would eventually make a move against him, since he was, through his mother, a member of the well-known Ngo Dinh family, whose members had been prominent in the service both of the Church and of the state of Vietnam before the communist takeover. Moreover, as Bishop of Nha Trang, he had warned the faithful of his diocese against the errors of communism in pastoral letters. Well-intentioned intermediaries now tried to persuade him, either personally or by letter, to return quietly to his former diocese, Nha Trang, or at least leave Ho Chi Minh City to avoid being arrested. Archbishop Thuan explained simply that he could not leave his new diocese unless ordered to do so by the Vatican. As always, he left everything in God's hands, prayed and waited. On 13th of August, that's my grandson's birthday, and he is 9, August Archbishop Thuan heard that the communist authorities had ordered all the Catholic priests in Ho Chi Minh City to attend a meeting on 15th of August at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the old Parliament building. On that day, he and Archbishop Nguyen van Binh were officially summoned to meet communist officials at the Independence Palace in a different part of the city. It was clear that the meeting for priests had been set up in order to prevent them from interfering with anything that was done to the 2 archbishops. The communists of North Vietnam had taken over Saigon on 30th of April 1975. Just 7 days before that, Pope Paul VI had appointed Bishop Thuan as coadjutor Archbishop of Saigon, with automatic right to succeed Archbishop Binh. The The Communists smelt a plot to set up as leader of Vietnam's Catholics a highly successful and popular man, and furthermore one with family connections in politics. His uncle, Ngo Dinh Diem, had been a former president of South Vietnam, assassinated in 1963. Arrest. The outcome of the summons to Independence Palace on 15th of August 1975 was Archbishop THUAN'S arrest. Then he did indeed return to Nha Trang, being put under strict house arrest in the parish of Kay Vong there. So began 13 years of various types of imprisonment, 9 of which he was to spend in solitary confinement in horrendous conditions. When first ordained a bishop, Thuan had taken as his episcopal motto the Latin words Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, the title of one of the outstanding documents of the Second Vatican Council. Circumstances had been difficult and challenging enough at the time, but now this motto was to mean more and more to him as his pastoral and spiritual life took a completely new turn. As he was driven the 250 miles from Ho Chi Minh City to Nha Trang, he prayed, "I have been arrested on the Feast of the Assumption, on the day the Church celebrates the glorious ascent of the Blessed Virgin Mary to heaven. She who shows me the way to eternal life will tell me what to do with my remaining days on earth." The background and history. Vietnam, now an independent socialist state, is a long, narrow country running down the east coast of the Indo-Chinese peninsula in Southeast Asia, bounded on the east and south by the Gulf of Tonkin and the South China Sea, on the west by Laos and Cambodia, and on the north by China. Vietnam was under Chinese domination for many centuries. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to land there in the 16th century. They were followed by the 17th century by Dutch, French, and English traders and French missionaries. In 1802, the regions of Tonkin in the north, Annam in the centre, and Cochin China in the south united to become the Empire of Vietnam. This was soon, however, to be overrun by the French, who first established protectorates in the 3 zones of the country, and then in 1887 formed the French Indo-Chinese Union, comprising Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In part, this progressive takeover was in response to the fierce persecutions of Christians, both French missionaries and native Vietnamese, which had been a constant feature of Vietnamese history for the previous 300 years. In the 50 years leading up to the French takeover, it is estimated that 300,000 Christians were either martyred or subjected to extreme hardships designed to make them renounce their faith. The memories, both distant and recent, of the sufferings the martyrs had gone through and the witness they had borne to Christ have always been an inspiration to Vietnamese Catholics and have strengthened them in their faith. World War II. During the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, Vietnam was occupied by the Japanese. In 1941, the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh formed a political military force, including both Vietnamese nationalists and communists, called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh, whose aim was to liberate Vietnam from the Japanese, then gain independence from France. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, moves to gain independence from France resulted in the War of Indochina, which started in the year I was born, 1946, and concluded in 1954 with the withdrawal of the French after their defeat at Dien Phu in the north of Vietnam. The Emperor Bao Dai abdicated as head of state in 1955, and the Republic of Vietnam was partitioned into the Communist Republic in the north, often referred to as the Viet Cong, and the State of Vietnam in the south. The last troops finally left South Vietnam in 1956, and great numbers of refugees fled from North Vietnam to the south to escape the communists. Vietnam War. Armed conflicts between the two parts of the country escalated into full-scale civil war in 1964, and America, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, sent troops and military supplies to support the South, while the Soviet Union in response supported the North. The war lasted until 1975, causing huge numbers of deaths and immense suffering, with refugees constantly moving from one part of the country to another in search of safety, relying on an informal American promises of continuing support. The president of South Vietnam signed a peace deal with the North in 1973, known as the Paris Peace Accords, and the last American troops left Vietnam at the end of March that year. With a change of president in America, however, it became clear that no American support was to be forthcoming, and by mid-1975, The communists of North Vietnam had completed their takeover of the South. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese emigrated over the following 30 years to escape the communist regime. Some by normal channels, but very many as boat people, escaping by sea without tickets or documents, in the hope of being granted asylum in any country they managed to reach. They underwent terrible sufferings, and many died en route. Communities of Vietnamese expatriates now exist in very many countries around the world. Early life, joy and hope. Francis Xavier Nguyen van Thuan was born on 17th of April 1928 in the parish of Phu Cam in the city of Hue in central Vietnam. His father was Thaddeus Nguyen van Am, and his mother was Elizabeth Ngo Dinha Thai Hyep. He was the eldest of their 8 surviving children. Their first baby had died in a cholera epidemic at the age of 2, just 6 months before THUAN'S birth. This early tragedy, in which they were supported by their devout faith, may have been why his parents chose the name Thuan. For their son, it means conforming to the will of God. Thuan's family, on both his father's and his mother's side, were closely united, intelligent and gifted. They were deeply religious and also ardent patriots, working for an independent Vietnam. It was a Catholic family, proud to be the descendants of martyrs. His father was very strict, but a wise and dedicated man. His mother was also wise and capable. He had a very happy childhood. His parents taught their children to be devout and truthful. All his life, Thuan preserved a deeply felt love for the beauty of the Vietnamese landscapes and the sea. Early vocation. Between the ages of 6 and 12, Thuan went to school at the Pellerin Institute in Hue, run by the Brothers of Christian Schools, a French missionary religious order. He made his first Holy Communion when he was 10. He always loved to learn about and practice his faith, and soon came to feel that God might call him to the priesthood when he was old enough. Accordingly, he asked his parents if he could enter the ANNIH Minor Seminary, which was about 100 miles north of Hue and was run by the Parish Foreign Missionary Society. He entered an NINHA in August 1940 and studied there for 7 years, going home to Hue for the holidays. He loved his time there and worked very hard, benefiting from all the subjects and reading deeply. The surroundings were extremely beautiful, and Thuan, who loved nature, drank in the scenery. The food provided was not so good, and many years later he remarked that living on the food in An Ninha had been an excellent preparation for surviving on prison fare, which was often atrocious. Thuan was highly intelligent and gifted with a remarkable memory. At an NIH minor seminary, he exercised and developed his intellectual capacity in training for his later life. His brilliance did not usually strike people straight away because he never made a parade of it. His phenomenal memory was evident later, during his various imprisonments, when he drew extensively on his recollection of spiritual books, said Mass from memory, recited and taught others hymns in Latin, and so on. La Vang Shrine. In the autumn of 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Thuan and some of his schoolmates went on a pilgrimage to the shrine of La Vang. This was where Our Lady had appeared to some Catholics who had fled into the jungle during a particularly fierce period of persecution in the 1790s. She promised them her protection and saved them from despair, giving them the courage to rebuild their lives and keep their faith. Afterward, a church was built on the site and became a center for Vietnamese Catholics' devotion to Mary. Thuan and his friends prayed to her for continuing protection for their country. Menaced by Japanese expansionism and torn between support for the forces opposing Nazism and a longing for independence, which produced growing resentment of the French colonies. At the end of the Second World War, Thuan was finishing his 4th year at the minor seminary. Like most of the world, he was horrified by the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by atomic bombs. He learned to pray for all, making no distinction in his heart between sufferers, even if they were his families or his country's enemies. It was the beginning of a long interior battle to deepen in forgiveness and overcome resentment. Ordained priest. In 1947, aged 19, he entered the THUAN'S Major Seminary to begin his studies for the priesthood in earnest. embarking on a 2-year course in philosophy, followed by 4 years of theology. He was ordained to the priesthood on the 11th of June, 1953, by Bishop Jean-Baptiste Eurasia of Hué, and celebrated his first Mass the following day in the presence of his family in the cathedral at Phu Cam. On becoming a priest, thus consciously committed himself to a life of love, prayer, and service in obedience to the bishop. He was looking forward passionately to beginning his pastoral work as a priest among the Catholics of his country, and especially the very poorest. At the same time, he was quickly open to discovering the following God's will, wherever it might lead. Like all Catholics, in Vietnam at that time, he knew that the stormy time they had already gone through was certainly not the end of their problems. He was first sent to Tam Toa parish in Dong Hoi City, Quang Binh Ha, about 100 miles to the north of Hué. He was assistant to the parish priest there. Father Tam Hu started training him on the first areas of parish pastoral work. However, Father Thuan soon developed serious symptoms and was diagnosed with advanced tuberculosis. Less than 3 months after arriving in Tam Toa, he was rushed back to Hué for treatment. Serious illness cured. Father Thuan's condition turned out to be so serious that the doctors at the hospital in Hué sent him to Saigon in December of the same year, 1953, where better treatment would be available. However, the doctors at the first hospital he was taken into refused to operate. It was clear that he would need to have part, if not all, of one lung removed, and there was a very high risk that he would not survive such an operation. In April 1954, he was moved to the Grau French Military Hospital, also in Saigon. He was to have the operation on 5th of May. That morning, the surgeon asked for one final X-ray to be taken before he started the operation. To the doctor's utter amazement, all traces of tuberculosis had disappeared, and both his lungs were sound and healthy. Father Thuan, who had been preparing to die, said simply, "It is a miracle," and thanked God and his Blessed Mother, while asking for light to see what they wanted him to do with his unexpectedly restored health. Parish priest. About a month later, instead of returning to his original parish, he was asked to assist the parish priest of St. Francis in Hue. It was a large parish, and most of the parishioners were French. However, after the disastrous defeat of French forces by the Viet Minh at the beginning of May 1954, it was clear to everyone that the time of the French settlers was coming to an end. They would soon be leaving Vietnam, and nobody knew what sort of vacuum their going would create, or how it would be filled. Father Thuan worked hard to help with this time of transition and built up the parish for the Vietnamese parishioners. Some months later, he was made chaplain of the Pellerin Institute, his own junior school, as well as of Saigon's Central Hospital and its prisons. It was his first encounter with prison life, which he was later to experience for 13 long years as a prisoner himself. Excuse me a moment, I must take a drink because my throat is being affected by not doing so. Communist threat. In October 1955, after a referendum, the position of emperor was abolished and Vietnam became a republic. The partition of Vietnam into North and South was formalized, with Ho Chi Minh remaining leader of the Communist North and Father Thuan's maternal uncle, Ngo Dinh Ha Diem, being appointed President of the South. By the end of April 1956, the last troops left Vietnam. And hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees flooded southwards from the north side of the divide. They were mainly Catholics, desperate to escape communist rule, which they had every reason to fear would involve harsh persecution of the Christian faith. From their family memories and traditions, they knew only too well the extremes to which anti-Christian persecution could be carried. Let that be a warning to all of us. Studies in Rome. Father Thuan's bishop was keenly aware of the need for well-instructed Vietnamese clergy who could guide the church in Vietnam after all the foreign missionaries had left or been sent out of the country. Seeing in Father Thuan a gifted and dedicated priest with a flair for languages, he decided to send him to Rome to study for a doctorate in canon law at the Urbana University. Father Thuan arrived in Rome in the late summer of 1956. I would have been 10 then. while studying and doing research for his doctorate. He lived at the Collegio San Pietro and made very good use of his time in Rome and Europe. He revelled in the rich architecture, which he was all the more keenly aware of, since his father's family were architects and builders, and his father had made a point of educating him in an appreciation of building construction and design. Father Thuan also realized the vast resources of books that were available to him during his all too brief stay in Rome, and made the most of them in the time he had. Above all, he appreciated the opportunity to meet and learn from all sorts of different people in the church and see for himself what the universality of the Catholic Church meant. With his uncle, Bishop Thuc of Hue, he attended an audience with Pope Pius XII, for whom he felt enormous admiration and reverence. He also met Bishop Juan Hervas, one of the founders of the Cursillos de Cristiandad movement in Rome, and learned a lot from him. Trials and sufferings. During his time in Rome, he made many friends and took advantage of being in Europe to visit other countries besides Italy. In the summer of 1957, he travelled to Ireland and then France, making a pilgrimage to Lourdes. There he prayed to Our Lady's message to Saint Bernadette. I do not promise you joy and consolation on this earth, but rather trials and suffering. In God's presence, Thuan freely took this message as addressed to him personally and accepted in advance the trials and sufferings that his life would bring. For love of God, leaving Lourdes, he went straight to the shrines of Our Lady at Fatima in Portugal to renew his self-dedication to Our Lady. Father Thuan's canon law doctoral thesis was on the organization of military chaplains around the world. He was awarded his doctorate in the summer of 1959. He had intended to spend one last summer visiting different places in Europe, but then came the news that his aunt Ho Ang was terminally ill with cancer. As his family meant so much to him, he changed his plans and travelled back to Vietnam as fast as he could. But delayed by visa problems, he was unable to get home before she died. Back to an Ninh seminary. His first job on his return was as a teacher at An Ninh minor seminary, because the original site of An Ninh was on the wrong side of the demarcation line, which now separated north and south. The minor seminary had moved to Piha Exuan, previously his own major seminary. The seminarians from Piha Exuan had moved to Saigon. Late in the following year, he was appointed rector of the Phu Exuan Seminary. At this point, he undertook construction of a new minor seminary so that the major seminarians could move back to Phu Exuan. With his ingrained love of building designs, as well as his practical experience of living and studying in a seminary on both sides of the student-teacher divide, he was able to contribute a great deal to the work of designing the new minor seminary, which was called Hoan Thien. It took 2 years to complete and opened in autumn 1962. Pope Pius XII died in 1958, while Thuan was still in Rome, and his successor, Pope John the 23rd, convoked the Second Council Vatican, which began on 11th of October 1962. John died the following year, but Pope Paul VI, who succeeded him, decided to continue the council. In Vietnam, Thuan mourned the death of Pope John, whom he loved and venerated, and did all he could to keep abreast of the news and developments in Rome. In May 1963, Vietnam was convulsed by what became known as the Buddhist affair. The vast majority of Vietnamese were Buddhists, but many of them felt they were discriminated against by the president, THUAN'S maternal uncle, who was a Catholic. Stirred up by a leading Buddhist monk, some Buddhists demonstrated outside the radio station in Hue. The demonstration was interrupted by an explosion which killed 8 people. The cause of the explosion remained unclear, but it was immediately blamed on the government and ultimately on President Nguyen Diem himself. Trouble continued, and on the 1st of November, some of the army generals, with the support of American elements, staged a coup. Diem and his brother Nhu were assassinated the following day. Nguyen Diem. This is not the place to discuss the figure of Nguyen Diem, Thuan's mother's brother. Still less to follow in detail the complicated political and military story of 20th century Vietnam. Nguyen Diem had been briefly Prime Minister and afterwards President of South Vietnam. Cardinal Thuan was very close to all his family, particularly his maternal uncle, and had spent a long time listening to them and discussing things with them in his formative years. He learned much from their insights, but when Diem became president of South Vietnam in 1955, while Thuan was still a young priest, Thuan saw the danger of accepting the help and support which his uncle would very willingly have given him, and resolved to avoid it at all costs. It could have led to a sort of nepotism, precisely what Diem was accused of by his detractors. Thuan always said frankly that the picture of Diem presented by the Vietnamese and the world media after the communist takeover of Vietnam was completely divorced from the reality of the man he had known. He considered that Diem was a sincerely good, wise and contemplative man whose dedication to his country and deep faith led him to take on the impossible task of trying to keep Vietnam both independent and free. More conflict in Vietnam. After his uncle's deaths, Father Thuan struggled hard to be able to forgive their murderers. Praying not to give way to bitterness and the temptation to despair. Vietnam's situation was clearly desperate, as the communists in the north were being attacked first by China and then by Russia, and the regime in the south was being supplied with weapons and military by America. I'll cut in here, it sounds a bit familiar. They've always done this all over the world, right to this moment in time. They're still doing it, interfering in other countries. Was being supplied with weapons and military by America. Nothing changes with them, does it? Who virtually controlled government and army alike. Conflict soon broke out in the south between the Buddhist activists and the army generals who had staged the coup and were now in government. Father Thuan knew excuse me, that a communist takeover was ultimately almost inevitable, which would spell the end of religious freedom. Added to all this was Father Thuan's concern for his mother, who had been so deeply affected by the deaths of her brothers, including a third, Can, who was imprisoned after the coup and tried and executed in May 1964. That she eventually suffered a complete collapse. She was taken into hospital in Saigon, where she slowly regained her health. Throughout her illness, she continued to be a source of moral strength to Father Thuan and helped him enormously with her example of deep faith and spirituality. Bishop Thuan witnessed to hope on the 13th of April 1967, just days before his 39th birthday. Father Thuan was unexpectedly appointed Bishop of Nha Trang. He was ordained a bishop at the Hoan Thien Seminary in Hue on 24th of June that year. Like Hue, the city of Nha Trang was on the east coast of Vietnam, but well down in the south, more than halfway to Saigon. Over 1/10 of the population of his new diocese were Catholics. The diocese had been inaugurated by Bishop Lambert de la Motte in 1671, and Thuan was its first native Vietnamese bishop. Intense pastoral work. For the next 8 years, Bishop Thuan worked to build up the faith and religious practice of the laity in his diocese, following the authentic spirit of the Second Vatican Council. He restored I'm just trying to keep track of this. He restructured parish councils and trained lay people to lead them. He strengthened the work of the Legion of Mary and introduced the Cursillos de Cristiandad and Focolare movements to the diocese. He built schools and trained catechists. He wanted to see Christian faith and charity firmly rooted among the laity, manifested among other ways in understanding and fellowship towards those of other faiths or none. And as always, he led by his own example. He also included non-Vietnamese Catholics in his pastoral concern. At this time, there were mainly members of the American forces serving at army bases in his diocese, and in his knowledge of military chaplaincies stood him in good stead. On the foundation of the renewal of the laity, including devotion to Mary, the Mother of God, he concentrated on promoting vocations to the priesthood. He also worked to establish and develop the different religious orders of both men and women in the diocese. Bishop Thuan put a great deal of thought and prayer into his pastoral letters, many of which contained strongly worded condemnations of the corruption which was to be found at every level of Vietnamese society. Writing from the heart simply and clearly, he awakened the consciences of Catholics to the fact that however deeply rooted the practice might be, it was totally incomparable with Christian teaching and seriously damaged individuals and the whole of society. He also explained the errors of communism, showing the true Christian answers to the problems which communism claimed to combat. Soon after setting to work on all this, he was elected president of the Committee of Social Justice. The Committee on Social Communications and the Committee of Development by the Vietnamese Bishops' Conference. He worked hard for many hours every day to be able to cope with all his many responsibilities. After all, above all, he knew that his first responsibility had to be a commitment to prayer, without which all these other activities would be pointless, however successful they might appear. Travels abroad. In 1970, Bishop Thuan went to India to prepare for the first General Assembly of Ancient Bishops, which was to meet in Manila, in the Philippines, that November. At the General Assembly, which was also attended by the Pope, he gave a presentation on the current political problems in Asia and their solutions. The following year, Bishop Thuan was appointed consultor to the Pontifical Commission for the Laity. When he travelled to Rome for this work, he met Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, Archbishop of Krakow, Poland, later Pope John Paul II, and was impressed by his devotion to Our Lady, his clear-mindedness, and his sense of humour. Communism in Vietnam. In 1973, brought the American involvement in the Vietnamese War to an end with the Paris Peace Accords. This made it virtually inevitable that the Communist North would eventually take over the whole of South Vietnam. Meanwhile, the country as a whole was in a terrible state, with millions of civilians driven from their homes, being killed or wounded by the fighting. There was huge disruption to agriculture, with much of the cultivated land on which the population depended for food poisoned mined every effort to helping resettle refugees. reconstruct the ruined villages, and rebuild the shattered communities. Bishop Thuan was put in an overall charge of this work by the Vietnamese bishops, who appointed him executive vice president of their relief agency, Cooperation for It's hard to read this at this time of night. So my eyes are not good. Sorry about this. Bishop Thuan was put in overall charge of this work by the Vietnamese bishops, who appointed him executive vice president of their relief agency, Cooperation for Reconstruction in Vietnam. A huge addition to his already burdensome responsibilities. At the Pope's request, he also travelled to different countries in the following 2 years, appealing for help in the forms of financial aid, skilled manpower, and prayer. Communist attacks from the north continued steadily, and although they met with plenty of resistance, there could ultimately be only one outcome. Civilian casualties continued to rise alongside military ones. In March 1975, Communist troops from North Vietnam captured the city of Ban Mi Thuot, some way to the east of Nha Trang. Thousands of soldiers and civilian refugees fled into the jungles of the Central Highland to escape the tanks and judges of the Central Highlands, to escape the tanks and artillery. They were ill prepared for their flight, but many casualties, and soon ran out of food and water. Bishop Thuan, having consulted his fellow bishops, hired aeroplanes to organize an airdrop of water, food, and basic medical supplies as the fastest way of bringing help from the point of view of the communists. This was an act of resistance which they would not forgive. Seeing that the communist takeover was now virtually complete, Bishop Thuan requested and received permission from the apostolic delegate to ordain to the priesthood all of the seminarians in his diocese who were adequately trained and prepared. Throughout the past 8 years, he had worked to increase the numbers of the priests in his diocese, and there was now a large number of seminarians. He ordained them in April, rejoicing that the faithful of his diocese would have plenty of good priests to care for them at the parish level. Meanwhile, his parents and 4 of his sisters had left Vietnam for good, and gone to settle in Australia. The separation was painful, but at least Bishop THUAN'S mind could be easy on the question of their safety. I'm going to stop here on page 25 because my eyes are so tired I cannot continue any further. And I've just noted, looking at the back, I'm halfway through. There's 60 pages, so I'm not quite halfway, but if you count the front page and the back page, yes. So I'm going to terminate this video. I'll make this part 1, and then tomorrow, hopefully, I'll do this before I do anything else, because it's not nice if you can't hear the second part as soon as you've heard the first. So when I start tomorrow sometime, I'm going to finish this Cardinal Nguyen van Thuan, his story, factual life, very, very sad and tragic, but what a good man. So I'm going to say good night, and thank you so much for listening. May God bless you and heal you. I'm sending you his peace in abundance, and I'll have to think about another chair for the work on the computer. That one is okay for maybe an hour or so, but not the hours that I've been doing, because it's and the settee, I won't know what the sound is like. I'll have a check, because maybe the sound is I'm too far away from the microphone while I'm sitting back in the settee. There's quite a gap. I'm not sure how it picks up. So I'll have to check all those things. Sorry about that. It's not like my normal ones, and it is far too late. I should not have begun recording this late at night, because it makes it very difficult, and it probably doesn't sound good enough anyway. So God bless and thank you. I'll do the rest of it tomorrow. Oh, I have to go over here to turn off the video because I'm nowhere near the computer. And that's another inconvenience. God bless. Good. And you see all the mess I've made there, and all the Christmas presents for the grandchildren to keep warm this cold winter.